The wind was a thief, stealing the breath from Emma's lungs and the warmth from her skin. It swept across the plains of Wyoming, a relentless force that carried the grit of the earth and the scent of distant, uncaring mountains. For 3 days, the jolting wagon had been her world, the canvas flap her only shield against the vast, indifferent sky. Inside her worn dress, clutched in a hand damp with nervous sweat, was the letter. It was her only currency, her only map, its sealed edge a stark line between the life that had been snatched away and the terrifying uncertainty that lay ahead. Double Creek Ranch. The name had been a whispered promise from her dying mother, a name tied to a man Emma had never known. Now, as the wagon crested a final rise, the ranch sprawled below, a collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings huddled against the immensity of the land. It looked hard and uncompromising, a place that tolerated life but did not welcome it. Fear, a cold and familiar companion since her mother's last breath, coiled tighter in her stomach. She was 16 years old, an orphan, a supplicant arriving with nothing but a secret in an envelope. The wagon ground to a halt before the main house, a 2-story structure of formidable timber and stone, its windows like vacant eyes. A woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She was tall and severe, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her cheekbones. Her gaze swept over Emma, a swift and dismissive appraisal that cataloged the dust on her dress and the exhaustion in her posture. This had to be Mrs. Brennan. There was an aura of ownership about her, as stark as a brand. Emma fumbled with the letter, her fingers clumsy and cold. She descended from the wagon, her legs unsteady on the solid ground, and approached the woman on the porch, holding out the envelope as if it were a shield. For Mr. Thomas Brennan, Emma's voice was a reedy whisper, nearly lost to the wind. The woman's expression did not soften. It sharpened. Mr. Brennan passed on 2 years ago, she stated, her tone flat and final. She took the letter, her movements economical and sharp. She did not invite Emma inside. She broke the seal with a decisive flick of her thumb and read, her face a mask of iron control. The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of the porch boards and the mournful cry of the wind. Emma watched the woman's eyes scan the page, saw a flicker of something, a tightening in the jaw, a glacial hardening of her gaze. When she finally looked up, the dispassionate coldness had been replaced by a focused, chilling animosity. "Sarah," she said, the name in indictment. "Your mother." Emma could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The woman folded the letter with chilling precision, the crisp sounds echoing in the silence. "My husband was a man of appetites," she said, her voice laced with a venom that had aged for years. "It seems you are the consequence of one of them." The word struck Emma with the physical force of a blow. The world tilted, the horizon blurring. Her father? Thomas Brennan? The man whose name was on the letter, the man whose home, this was her father? The entire foundation of her life, the simple story of a loving mother and a father lost to fever long ago, crumbled into dust. She was not who she thought she was. She was a secret, a shame. "He left nothing for you," Mrs. Brennan continued, her voice merciless. "This ranch, everything on it is mine." The law is clear on that. Despair washed over Emma, so potent it threatened to buckle her knees. She had nowhere else to go. She was a piece of driftwood washed up on a hostile shore. Seeing the raw panic in Emma's eyes, Mrs. Brennan seemed to make a decision. It was not born of compassion. "You have your mother's hands, I suppose. We are short of help in the kitchen. You can earn your keep. The room in the back of the scullery is empty." She turned without waiting for an answer, the screen door slamming shut behind her, a final, unarguable decree. Emma stood alone in the swirling dust, the weight of a new, devastating truth pressing down on her. She was the daughter of the master of this house, and she had just been sentenced to serve in it. The days that followed bled into one another, a smear of lye soap, scalding water, and the perpetual ache in her back. Emma's world shrank to the confines of the cavernous kitchen and the small, windowless room behind it. The room was little more than a cell, containing a narrow cot, a single nail on the wall for a spare dress, and the constant, cloying smell of stored potatoes. Sleep offered little respite. Haunted by the specter of her mother's fading face and the sharp, cutting edges of Mrs. Brennan's words. Eleanor Brennan, as Emma soon learned the household staff called her, was a presence felt even when she was not seen. Her footsteps on the floorboards above were a harbinger of inspection, of fault-finding. She would appear in the kitchen doorway, her silence more unnerving than a shout, her eyes missing nothing. A smear of grease on the floor, a potato peeled too thickly, a moment of stillness that she deemed idleness. Her corrections were never loud. They were quiet, delivered with a chilling precision designed to humiliate. The daughter of Thomas Brennan should know how to scrub a floor without leaving streaks. She murmured once, close enough for only Emma to hear, the words a poisoned dart. Emma learned to make herself small, to move silently through the house, her gaze perpetually fixed on the floorboards. She was a ghost, a shadow, flitting at the edges of a life that should have been, in some way, hers. The other staff, a cook named Martha and 2 younger maids, treated her with a mixture of pity and caution. They knew. The whispers followed her like her own shadow. They understood the cruelty of her position, but they also understood the precariousness of their own. To show Emma too much kindness would be to draw the ire of the mistress. So they offered counsel in hushed tones, practical advice on how to stack firewood or pluck a chicken, but they kept an emotional distance. Friendship was a luxury none of them could afford. From the steamy kitchen window, Emma watched the life of the ranch she was barred from. She saw the ranch hands, a dozen or so men who moved with a purpose and freedom that felt like another language. They were weathered, lean men who belonged to the landscape. In the evenings, she would hear their faint laughter from the direction of the bunkhouse, a sound of camaraderie that only deepened her own profound isolation. Among them, one man stood apart, not because he was louder, but because he was quieter. His name was Jedediah, a fact she gleaned from the others. He was the foreman, a man who seemed to carry the stillness of the mountains within him. He rarely spoke, communicating with his men through short gestures and a steady, assessing gaze. Sometimes, while she was shaking out rugs on the back porch, she would feel his eyes on her. It wasn't a prying or judgmental look, it was watchful, neutral, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. He never acknowledged her directly, yet she felt seen by him in a way that was different from the others. He wasn't whispering, he was observing. The physical labor was grueling, her hands chapped and raw, her muscles screaming in protest each morning. But it was the hollowness inside that was the true burden. Her grief for her mother was a raw, open wound, and layered upon it was the shattering of her own identity. Who was she? Was she Emma, Sarah's daughter? Or was she the shameful secret of Thomas Brennan? Each glance at her own reflection in a pane of glass was a confrontation. Did she have his eyes? The shape of his jaw? She searched for a man she had never met in the lines of her own face, a desperate, painful quest for a connection that felt both undeniable and forbidden. The resilience her mother had instilled in her was the only thing that kept her from shattering completely. One foot in front of the other, one potato at a time. One day survived. It became her mantra, a silent prayer whispered into the steam of the laundry tub. She would endure. She had to. For her mother's memory, for the sliver of self that still remained, she would endure the cold scrutiny of Eleanor Brennan and the crushing loneliness of her father's house. It was an act of calculated cruelty that led her to the truth. Eleanor Brennan, noting Emma's quiet endurance with a flicker of annoyance, devised a new task. "My husband's study has been sealed since his passing," she announced one morning, her voice devoid of emotion. "It is collecting dust. I want it cleaned. Every book dusted, every surface polished. See that it is done." The implication was clear. She was sending Emma into the heart of the lion's den, forcing her to confront the ghost of the man who was both her father and her shame. The air in the study was thick and stagnant, smelling of old paper, leather, and time itself. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the heavy curtains. It was a masculine room, a heavy oak desk, shelves groaning with books on animal husbandry and geology, framed maps of the territory on the walls. For the first hour, Emma moved with a reverent fear, touching his things with a trembling hand. This was his chair. This was the pen he held. A phantom ache resonated deep in her chest, a grief for a man she'd never had the chance to know. It was while she was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the wide plank floors near the desk, that her fingers brushed against it, a board that gave slightly under her weight. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was almost certainly nothing. A loose nail, warped wood. But a strange, insistent curiosity compelled her. Casting a nervous glance at the closed door, she used the tip of her cleaning knife to carefully pry at the edge of the board. It lifted with a soft groan of protest, revealing a dark, shallow cavity beneath. Nestled inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. It was worn, the cover softened with use. His name, Thomas Brennan, was embossed in faded gold leaf on the front. This was it. This was a piece of him, hidden away from the world, hidden from his wife. Her first instinct was terror. If Eleanor found her with this, the consequences would be severe. Her life at Double Creek, tenuous as it was, would be over. She could be cast out with nothing, sent back into the unforgiving wilderness. But a stronger, fiercer impulse took hold. This was her father. This was his voice, his thoughts, his secrets. It was a connection she craved with a desperation that bordered on pain. It was a part of her own story, a story that had been stolen from her. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped the journal, tucked it into the waistband of her apron, and carefully replaced the floorboard, sweeping dust over the seams to hide any trace of her discovery. The rest of the day, the book was a hot, secret weight against her skin, a promise and a terror all at once. That night, long after the great house had fallen silent, Emma waited. She listened to the settling groans of the timber, the distant howl of a coyote, the rhythmic breathing of Martha in the cot across the room. When she was certain she was alone with the darkness, she pulled out the journal. By the flickering, meager light of a stolen candle stub, she opened the first page. The handwriting was strong and clear, the ink faded to a soft brown. It was not a daily diary, but a collection of thoughts, observations, and plans for the ranch. He wrote of the land not as a commodity, but as a living entity. He detailed his struggles with drought, his theories on crossbreeding cattle for resilience, his arguments with neighboring ranchers over water rights. Emma read of a man who was thoughtful, intelligent, and deeply passionate about his work. This was not the careless philanderer Eleanor had painted. This man was complex, driven, and, at times, deeply lonely. Then she found it. A series of entries from 17 years prior. He wrote of a trip to Laramie, of meeting a woman with a spirit as bright as a sunflower, Sarah. He wrote her name. He wrote of her laughter, of her kindness, of a connection that had blindsided him. I'm a married man. One entry read, the script tight with conflict. I have a duty, but my heart has learned a song I cannot unsing. The words were a revelation. It wasn't a sordid, fleeting appetite. It was love, a tormented, impossible love. A few pages later, a final, heartbreaking entry on the subject. She is gone. I sent her away with what money I could, a hollow gesture for a hollowed-out man. I told her it was for the best, a lie that will burn in me until my dying day. It is the great mistake of my life. Emma had to press her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. The candle flame wavered, casting dancing shadows on the page. Her mother had not been cast off in shame. She had been loved. Her father had not been a monster. He had been a man trapped by circumstance, a man who had regretted his choice for the rest of his life. In that small, airless room, with the secret words of her father as her only light, Emma felt the first true shift within her. The shame that had clung to her like a shroud began to feel less like her own and more like a garment someone else had forced upon her. She was not a consequence. She was the daughter of a man who had loved her mother, the daughter of a great mistake he had never stopped mourning. The unspoken kindnesses began subtly. a pail of water for the laundry, left by the back porch, that was only 3/4 full instead of brimming to the top, sparing her back the usual strain. An apple, polished and gleaming, left on the corner of the kitchen workbench, far from the watchful eyes of Martha or the mistress. Emma never saw who left them, but she knew. She would sometimes catch Jedediah's gaze from across the dusty yard as she carried out ashes or hung sheets on the line. He would be mending a harness or conferring with another hand, and for a fleeting second, his steady eyes would meet hers. There was no smile, no overt sign of friendship, just a quiet, solid acknowledgement that she existed. It was more than anyone else had offered. It was a lifeline in an ocean of indifference. The journal had become her secret strength, and Jed's silent support became her public one, however small. The change in her was imperceptible to most, but Eleanor Brennan, with her predator's instinct for any shift in the dynamics of her domain, noticed. Emma stood a little straighter. Her gaze no longer clung to the floor, but would sometimes lift, taking in the world beyond her chores. The simmering tension came to a head on a blistering afternoon when a cattle buyer, a stout, florid man named Henderson, came to negotiate a sale. He was a guest in the main house, and his boorish presence filled the rooms with the scent of cheap cigars and entitlement. Emma was serving him coffee in the parlor when he reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Well now," he boomed, his eyes roaming over her with a casual insolence. Brennan always did have an eye for fine stock. "Where'd you find this one, Eleanor?" Emma froze, her blood turning to ice. The humiliation was a physical thing, hot and suffocating. Eleanor, standing by the mantelpiece, offered a thin, cruel smile. "She is merely the help, Mr. Henderson. Pay her no mind," but Henderson was not so easily dissuaded. "Hardly looks like the help," he said, his thumb rubbing circles on the inside of her wrist. Emma tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Let go of me," she said, her voice a choked whisper. Just as Henderson chuckled, a low voice cut through the tension from the doorway. The man said, "Let the girl go." Jedediah stood there, filling the frame. He had removed his hat, but he still carried the dust and authority of the outdoors with him. His face was unreadable, his stance relaxed, but his eyes were fixed on Henderson's hand on Emma's arm, and they were as hard as granite. Henderson, flustered at being challenged by a ranch hand, released Emma's wrist with a dismissive shove. "Just admiring the local scenery, friend." "No harm done. She ain't scenery," Jedediah said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight of finality. "Mrs. Brennan, the men are asking about the north pasture fence." "Thought you should know." He gave a short, respectful nod to Eleanor, his eyes never straying back to Henderson, and then he was gone. The entire exchange had taken less than a minute, but the room felt fundamentally altered. Emma, rubbing her wrist, stared at the empty doorway. He had not only defended her, he had done it in front of Eleanor, a direct and public challenge to the established order, where Emma was less than nothing. Eleanor's face was a mask of fury, her lips a thin white line. She was angry not at Henderson for his crudeness, but at Jedediah for his intervention, and at Emma for being its cause. The silent war between them had just gained its first soldier, and he was not on Eleanor's side. Later that day, as Emma fed the chickens behind the kitchen, Jed passed by on his way to the stables. He stopped, not looking at her directly, but at the horizon. "Some men," he said to the setting sun, "ain't worth the dust on their boots." He then looked at her, a quick, direct glance. "You're right." "Yes," she managed, her voice stronger than she expected. "Thank you." He gave a single, short nod, then continued on his way. It was a simple exchange, but it forged a bond between them, an unspoken alliance built not on words, but on a shared understanding of justice in a place where it was often in short supply. Emma was no longer entirely alone. Night after night, the journal became her tutor, her confidant, the father she never knew speaking to her across the veil of death. His words were no longer just a comfort. They were a blueprint. She moved beyond the personal entries about her mother and delved into the soul of his life's work, the ranch. Thomas Brennan had been a visionary, a man who saw the land as a partner, not a subject to be conquered. He wrote of the fragility of the high plains ecosystem, of the dangers of overgrazing, of the paramount importance of water. He had plans, meticulously detailed, for a system of small reservoirs to capture spring runoff, a concept his neighbors had apparently mocked. He wrote of rotating pastures, not just for the health of the cattle, but for the regeneration of the native grasses. Eleanor, Emma was beginning to see, managed the ranch with a focus on short-term profit, selling off breeding stock that Thomas had deemed essential and running too many head on the delicate south-facing slopes. She was maintaining the ranch, but she was slowly bleeding it dry of its future. The most startling discovery came in a series of entries toward the back of the book. He wrote about a specific parcel of land, a lush, spring-fed meadow tucked away in the western quarter of the property. He had discovered it years ago, a small pocket of paradise hidden in a shallow canyon. "It is the one place on this earth that feels sacred," he wrote. "It reminds me of her, of Sarah." Emma's breath caught in her throat. He had named it, in the privacy of his journal, Sarah's Meadow. The entry that followed made her heart pound with a fierce, protective beat. "I have consulted a lawyer in Cheyenne. It is possible to deed the meadow and the spring that feeds it, a separate holding, in her name, a way to provide for her without tearing my world apart. I must find a way to get it to her." He had died before he could. The land, her mother's intended legacy, was still part of Double Creek, its significance known only to the dead man who had written these words and the daughter now reading them. This was more than just a name. It was a tangible piece of her father's intention. It was proof. It was hers. This knowledge changed her posture in the world. The shame and fear that had been her constant companions began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning ember of purpose. She was not just a servant in this house. She was the keeper of its founder's true vision. She started to observe with a new intensity, her tasks becoming a cover for her education. While weeding the garden, she studied the flow of the irrigation ditch, comparing it to her father's diagrams. While mending linens, she listened to the talk of the hands who came to the kitchen for water, hearing their concerns about the thinning grass in the east pasture. She was no longer just surviving. She was learning. She was seeing the ranch through her father's eyes, and what she saw was a legacy in peril. The disconnect between his dream and Eleanor's reality was a chasm. Eleanor saw the ranch as a symbol of her status, a machine for generating wealth. Thomas had seen it as a living, breathing covenant between man and nature. Emma, standing in the shadows, felt the weight of that covenant settling onto her own young shoulders. It was a terrifying, exhilarating burden. She held the soul of Double Creek in her hands, hidden within the pages of a worn leather book, and she was beginning to understand that simply protecting it would not be enough. She would have to fight for it. The ember of purpose began to glow brighter, demanding action. Emma knew she could not confront Eleanor directly. She had no power, no standing. Her only path was to win the trust of the men who worked the land, the men whose loyalty was to the ranch itself, not necessarily to its current mistress. Her first test came unexpectedly. A section of fence in the north pasture, the same one Jed had mentioned as a pretext to intervene with Henderson, had been trampled by a migrating herd of elk. A group of hands was preparing to repair it using the same methods they always had. From her father's journal, Emma remembered a detailed passage about fence building in high wind areas, a design using angled support posts and woven wire that was more resilient and required less maintenance. She chose her moment carefully, approaching a small group of the younger hands as they loaded posts onto a wagon. "If you angle the corner posts," she began, her voice quiet but clear, "and brace them against the tension, the fence will hold better against the snow drifts this winter." They looked at her, surprised and skeptical. A kitchen girl offering advice on fence lines was unheard of. "We know how to build a fence, girl," one of them said, not unkindly, but dismissively. Jedediah, who had been watching from the doorway of the tack room, walked over. He looked at Emma, then at the posts, his expression thoughtful. He didn't question where her knowledge came from. He simply considered the logic of it. "She's right," he said, his voice cutting through the men's skepticism. The wind rips the staples out on the straight posts every spring. Tried her way. That single endorsement was enough. They followed his lead, and by extension hers. The work was hard, but as the new section of fence took shape, even the most doubtful hands could see the superior strength of the design. A few of them cast her grudgingly appreciative looks. It was a small victory, but it was a start. She had planted a seed of respect. Eleanor, however, saw the bloom of a weed. She missed nothing. She saw the subtle shift in how the men spoke to Emma, no longer with pity, but with a nascent curiosity. She saw the way Jed's gaze would find her in the yard, and she did not like it. Her cruelty became more pointed, her efforts to isolate Emma more deliberate. She assigned her the most odious tasks, cleaning out the root cellar, mucking the chicken coop, jobs designed to keep her filthy and out of sight. A girl with such a keen interest in the workings of the dirt should not be afraid to get her hands in it, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. But the tactic backfired. The more Eleanor tried to push her down, the more Emma's resolve hardened. The dirt under her nails felt honest. The sweat on her brow was earned. While Eleanor ruled from the cold, pristine parlor, Emma was learning the ranch from the ground up, her knowledge becoming as ingrained as the grime on her hands. She was no longer just the keeper of her father's vision. She was becoming a part of it. She started to speak more with the hands, asking quiet questions about the cattle, the water levels in the creek, the health of the horses. She learned their names, not just Jed, but grizzled old Samuel and young, eager Billy. They, in turn, began to see past the girl in the servant's dress and glimpse the keen mind and resilient spirit within. The battle lines were being drawn, not with shouts and anger, but with quiet conversations, respectful nods, and the slow, inexorable shift of loyalty from the house on the hill to the girl who understood the land. That summer, the sky turned to brass. The sun was a relentless hammer, beating down on the plains until the grasses turned brittle and the earth cracked like old pottery. The creek that gave the ranch its name dwindled to a muddy trickle. The air grew thick with a hazy, ominous stillness, and the scent of dust was replaced by the distant, acrid smell of smoke from fires burning in the mountains to the west. A palpable tension settled over Double Creek. The cattle grew thin, their lowing a constant, miserable complaint. The men's faces were grim, their tempers short. Eleanor Brennan, for all her iron control within the house, was at a loss against the silent, creeping devastation of the drought. Her orders became frantic and contradictory. She commanded the men to move the entire herd to the south pasture, the one already overgrazed and farthest from the failing creek. Jedediah and the senior hands argued against it, but she would not be swayed, her pride refusing to brook any challenge to her authority. It was a recipe for disaster. The crisis arrived not as a spark, but as a wave. A dry lightning storm rolled in one evening, a terrifying display of celestial fury with no rain to accompany it. A single bolt struck a lightning-scarred pine on the ridge overlooking the western pastures, the location of Sarah's meadow. Within minutes, fanned by a hot, gusting wind, the ridge was ablaze. Fire, the most primal fear of the plains. Panic erupted. Men shouted. Horses whinnied in terror. Eleanor stood on the porch, her face a pale mask of shock, shouting orders to save the main house, to protect the barn. Her focus was on the assets, the buildings. But Emma, her heart seizing with a different kind of terror, knew the true danger. Her father's journal had contained a chapter on wildfire, his handwriting urgent and stark. He'd written about the treacherous canyon winds and how a fire on that specific ridge, if not contained, would sweep down into the valley and trap the entire herd against the fences of the south pasture. It would be a slaughter. While Eleanor was screaming about buckets of water for the house, Emma ran. She ran not to the house, but to the bunkhouse, where the men were grabbing axes and shovels in a state of disorganized fear. She saw Jedediah, trying to rally them, his voice a low roar against the growing clamor. No! Emma's voice, high and clear with adrenaline, cut through the noise. Not the house. The fire will jump the creek bed. We have to get ahead of it, at the canyon mouth, The men stared at her, their faces lit by the hellish orange glow from the ridge. A kitchen girl giving orders at a time, like this? It was madness. But Jedediah looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a girl, but the same clear-eyed certainty he'd seen when she'd talked about the fences. He saw a leader. "What's the plan?" he asked, his question a transfer of command. Emma's mind raced, her father's words echoing in her head. "The old logging trail below the canyon. It's wide enough. We can make a fire break there. We need every man with a shovel and an axe. We have to clear it down to the dirt before the fire reaches the canyon floor." It was a desperate gamble, a race against the wind. But it was a plan, a clear strategy in the face of chaos. Jedediah didn't hesitate. "You heard her," he bellowed to the men. "To the logging trail. Move." They followed. They trusted him, and in that moment, his trust in her was absolute. They worked with a desperate, unified fury, a team forged in the crucible of the fire. Emma worked alongside them, her hands, already calloused, quickly blistering on the shovel handle. The heat was immense, the smoke a choking blanket, but she did not falter. She was fighting for more than cattle. She was fighting for her father's meadow, for his legacy, for the very soul of the ranch. Through the smoke and the chaos, she was no longer Emma, the servant. She was Brennan, daughter of Thomas, defender of Double Creek. By dawn, they were a company of ghosts, their faces blackened with soot, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. But they had won. The fire, reaching the wide, raw earth break they had carved out of the trail, had met its match. It licked at the edges, sending up furious sparks, but could not jump the gap. The main herd, the barns, and the hidden jewel of Sarah's meadow were safe. As the sun rose, casting a pallid, smoky light over the ravaged landscape, the men leaned on their tools, looking at the line they had held. Then, one by one, their gazes turned to Emma. She stood among them, small and soot-stained, her dress torn, her knuckles bleeding. But she stood tall. In their eyes, she saw a new respect, deep and profound. It was awe. In the exhausted silence of a new day, the power structure of Double Creek Ranch had been burned away and forged anew. The aftermath was a landscape of stark contrasts. The blackened ridge stood as a grim testament to the night's battle, while below it, the valley floor remained untouched, a fragile green saved from flames. The emotional landscape of the ranch was similarly divided. The hands, united by shared peril and victory, moved with a new sense of purpose, their loyalty quietly but irrevocably transferred. They looked to Emma for direction. Their questions about the day's work addressed to her as often as to Jedediah. Eleanor Brennan, on the other hand, was isolated in her defeat. She had stood on the porch and watched as her authority evaporated in the smoke. The fact that the ranch had been saved not by her commands, but by the intervention of the girl she despised was a humiliation too profound to bear. The confrontation was inevitable. It came 2 days later in the main yard under the harsh light of the midday sun. Eleanor marched out of the house, her face a thunderous mask, and stopped before Emma, who was conferring with Jed about moving the cattle to fresh water. "You," Eleanor spat, her voice tight with repressed fury. "You will go back to the kitchen where you belong. Your time playing rancher is over." Emma did not flinch. The frightened girl who had arrived months ago was gone, burned away in the fire. She met Eleanor's glare with a calm, steady gaze. "My place is here," she said, her voice even. "With the ranch your place?" Eleanor's laugh was a brittle, ugly sound. "You have no place here. You are a bastard, a stain on my husband's name. You have nothing. You are nothing." The words, which once would have shattered her, now felt like hollow echoes from a distant past. Emma took a deep breath. The time for secrets was over. "I am his daughter," she said, the words ringing with indisputable truth in the quiet yard. "And I have this." She walked into the house, the men watching in silence, and returned moments later with a leather journal. She held it out not as a weapon, but as evidence. He wrote it all down. His plans, his regrets, his love for my mother. She looked directly into Eleanor's eyes. He wrote about Sarah's meadow, the land he intended for her, for me. He wrote about his vision for this ranch, a vision you have ignored. This ranch isn't just a source of income, Mrs. Brennan. It was his life's work, his dream, and you have been letting it die. A wave of shock rippled through the assembled hands. This was the source of her knowledge, the secret font of her wisdom. It was the voice of the old boss, speaking through his daughter. Eleanor stared at the journal as if it were a venomous snake. Her face, already pale, lost all its color. She had been defeated not by an accusation, but by the truth in her own husband's hand. Her power was built on her status as his widow, the sole inheritor of his legacy. But the journal proved that she was not its true keeper. The true heir was standing before her, covered in the dirt of the land her father loved. "Get out," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. "All of you." "This is my house." Jedediah stepped forward, his position subtly but definitively beside Emma. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Old Samuel took off his hat and held it over his chest. Billy and the others followed suit. Their silent, unmoving presence was a judgment more powerful than any shout. They were with Emma. They were with Brennan. Eleanor looked at their faces, at the ring of quiet defiance, and she finally understood. She had lost. The ranch was no longer hers. With a choked sound of utter defeat, she turned and fled back into the cold sanctuary of the house, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed across the yard, the final, closing note of an old and bitter song. Emma stood in the sun, the journal in her hand, the future of Double Creek resting squarely on her shoulders. The silence that followed the slam of the door was not empty. It was filled with the weight of change, a new and untested gravity settling over the ranch. Eleanor did not emerge from the house again that day, or the next. She became a ghost in her own home, a bitter recluse whose reign had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, collective turning of backs. She was not forced out. There was nowhere for her to go, and Emma, for all that had passed, could not bring herself to cast the woman into the wilderness. An unspoken truce was established. Eleanor kept to the house, a queen of a silent, shadowy kingdom of 2 rooms, and Emma, with Jedediah as her steadfast partner, took the reins of the land. The work of rebuilding began immediately, and it was harder than fighting the fire. Emma had her father's vision, but translating his words from the page to the soil was a monumental task. The initial respect she had won in the crisis now had to be solidified through relentless effort and sound judgment. She was no longer just issuing commands in an emergency. She was making the day-to-day decisions that determined the ranch's survival. She started with water. Guided by the journal's detailed schematics, she led the hands in digging the first of the small reservoirs her father had designed. It was back-breaking work under a punishing sun. Emma did not direct from the shade. She was in the ditch with the men, her shovel moving in rhythm with theirs. Her hands, once raw from lye soap, became calloused and strong from the grip of a handle. She learned the heft of a rock, the thirst of the dry earth. The men, who had first been awed by her leadership, now came to respect her work ethic. She was not a lady playing at being a rancher. She was one of them, her sweat mingling with theirs in the dust. Neighbors were skeptical. Riders from adjacent properties would stop at their fence lines, watching the strange project with unconcealed doubt. Word had spread about the young girl who was now running Double Creek. They saw her as an oddity, an upstart. When she rode to the nearby town of Redemption for supplies, the merchants and cattle agents who had dealt with Eleanor treated her with a condescending politeness, their eyes betraying their disbelief. "A bit much for a young lady to handle, isn't it?" the feed store owner asked, a patronizing smile on his face. "The ranch handles itself, if you listen to what it needs," Emma replied, her voice steady, her gaze direct. She refused to be intimidated. She conducted her business with a quiet competence that slowly chipped away at their prejudice. She paid her bills on time. She spoke of cattle prices and grazing rights with a knowledge that surprised them. Jedediah was always with her on these trips, a silent, formidable presence at her side. He rarely spoke, but his unwavering support was a clear message to all. This is the authority. Respect it. They began to build a new community, one based on the principles in the journal. They treated their livestock with care, culled the herd to a sustainable size, and began the slow process of nursing the overgrazed pastures back to health. Emma established a fairer system of pay for the hands and ensured the bunkhouse was well maintained and supplied. The ranch, under her guidance, began to feel less like a business and more like a commonwealth, a place where everyone had a stake in its success. It was a slow, arduous transformation, but with every fence mended, every calf born healthy, every new blade of grass that pushed through the recovering soil, Emma was not just rebuilding a ranch. She was building a home. 2 years passed. The seasons turned, bringing with them the life-giving snows of winter and the green explosion of spring. The reservoirs Emma had built, once mocked as foolish ditches, were now full, reflecting the wide Wyoming sky. The creek, its watershed no longer strained, ran clear and strong. Double Creek Ranch was not just surviving, it was thriving. It had become a model of stewardship, its cattle healthier, its pastures more resilient than any of its neighbors. The name Brennan was once again spoken with respect in the territory, but now it was attached to the daughter, not the father. Emma stood on the same ridge where the fire had begun, the scent of pine and rich earth replacing the memory of smoke and ash. The land below was a patchwork of healthy greens and browns, a testament to the work of her hands and the wisdom of her father's words. She was 19 now. The frightened, grieving girl who had arrived in a dusty dress was a memory. In her place stood a woman, confident and serene, her connection to the land as deep and unshakable as the roots of the ancient cottonwoods along the creek. Jedediah came to stand beside her, their comfortable silence a language of its own. Their partnership had deepened into a bond of profound respect and unspoken affection. He was her foreman, her advisor, her most trusted friend. He had watched her transform, had stood by her through every trial, and in his steady gaze, she saw her own strength reflected. "The meadow looks good," he said, his eyes on the lush green expanse of Sarah's meadow below. It was now legally hers, the paperwork filed in Cheyenne, a quiet correction of an old sorrow. "My father would have liked to see this," Emma said, her voice soft. For a long time, she had felt she was living out his legacy, fulfilling his dreams. But looking out over the flourishing ranch, she realized it was more than that. She had taken his vision and melded it with her own resilience, her own compassion. She had honored her father, and she had honored her mother by turning a place of potential shame into a sanctuary of strength. The journal was no longer a secret guide she consulted in the dark. It was a history, the first chapter in a story she was now writing herself. She was no longer defined by the secrets of her birth or the pain of her losses. She was defined by the fences she had mended, the loyalty she had earned, the life she had nurtured from the cracked, dry earth. She was Emma Brennan, mistress of Double Creek, a woman who had found her identity not in a bloodline, but in the heart of the land itself. The wind swept up the ridge, the same wind that had once felt so cruel and unforgiving. Now, it felt like a promise, carrying the scent of growing things, of a future she had built with her own 2 hands. Her journey had begun in despair, but it had led her here, to a place of peace and purpose. She had found her family, not in a grand house, but in the steadfast loyalty of the people by her side. She had claimed her inheritance, not of wealth, but of a dream. And here, on the land that bore her mother's name, under the vast and watchful sky, she was finally, truly home.